I'm Grant, a proud supporter and member of Addressing Gettysburg Officers Club on Patreon. This remarkable podcast was found by many listeners during the COVID pandemic. It's not an overstatement to say that Addressing Gettysburg saved lives during that time in our history. Of all the factors for COVID survival, Addressing Gettysburg was amongst the most crucial. One might be curious as to how this amazing podcast began. Well, just like Abraham Lincoln growing up in a log cabin, Addressing Gettysburg had humble beginnings with its first studio located in a bicycle shed. Through bewildering content releases, it transcended this meager origin. We can't talk about Addressing Gettysburg without discussing the genius behind the microphone, the conductor of events, as it were. The book of Genesis states that in the beginning God created heaven and earth. Another momentous occasion occurred in New Jersey in the late 1970s. A star was born, Matthew Callery. A man of limitless accomplishments and unbridled modesty. A man of charm, wit, sagacity, and a master of subtlety. Matt is not without his flaws, though. Perhaps his greatest flaw is that he is too selfless. He cares too much for his fellow man, rarely ever thinking of himself. Like other great pioneers, the Wright brothers, Edison, Henry Ford, Matt had difficulty relating to the common townsfolk. But Matt is a true artiste who suffers for his craft, and like important great artists, he is misunderstood in his own time. He will be remembered as a great storyteller, a raconteur, a man for all seasons. I humbly submit that through his singular mission of educating the masses about the Battle of Gettysburg, and his dedication to the memory of those who fought there, Matt has performed a miracle, making the general public interested and excited about history. It is truly exceptional that such a self-made man has lived the American dream. This is a true rags to riches tale. That's not to say Matt Callery does this for the money, the fame, the glory. No, sir. What matters most to the esteemed Mr. Callery is that this event is remembered for all time. That's why it's imperative that all listeners join the Officers Club on Patreon. Have a nice day.
From the Gettysburg Museum of History Studios, you're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, patrons. Welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg. And today we are talking, you know how a while ago we did an episode with Jim Hessler about Gettysburg connections to the Little Bighorn. Well, today we are talking with a fella named Harry Smeltzer, and we're talking about Gettysburg and Bull Run connections. First Bull Run is specifically what we're talking about. So that's what we've got going today. Harry is a real estate appraiser, but he also runs the bullrunnings.wordpress.com website since November 2006. He's been doing that one, so you might have heard of that. He speaks at roundtables. He's on the board of Save Historic Antietam. He's written for Civil War Times and other publications, and currently in Civil War Times they have an article called Seeing the Elephant about first experiences with battle at Bull Run, among millions of other things that he told me he did. But I said, well, I could spend all this time giving your bio, or give a little bit of the bio and then actually have something in the show to talk about, because he does so many things. So let's just get right on. Welcome, Harry, to the show.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Pardon me. So let's talk. First, let's do an overview of the Battle of Bull Run. Just figured it'd be good for the audience, to get out of Gettysburg a little bit, change gears, and then jump back into Gettysburg. So go ahead. Overview of Bull Run.
All right. Basically, the first Battle of Bull Run was the first what we call a set-piece battle of the Civil War. And it was fought on July 21st, 1861. The Confederate Army had developed this line of defense in northern Virginia around the rail junction at Manassas and roughly along the line of a stream called Bull Run. That had developed over the whole spring and summer in the development of, not summer, but the whole spring, where the Confederacy was in a state of flux as to who belonged to it. Okay, so we're in Virginia, but Virginia wasn't in the Confederacy from day one.
Right.
They seceded a little later, and after they seceded, they still weren't necessarily a part of the Confederacy. So they had not suborned their military to overall Confederate States Army Command.
Okay.
So actually the guy that was in charge of this, strangely enough, people don't usually associate him with Bull Run, was Robert E. Lee. Was kind of orchestrating this whole thing as the commander of Virginia. And I'm not sure if they were called the Virginia Provisional Army or not at that point in time.
But was he attached to the governor or to Jefferson Davis?
Governor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So he
was a state official.
Right. He's not commander of all Confederate forces.
No.
He's a commander of Virginia forces or forces in Virginia.
In Virginia.
That's probably more accurate, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
And of course, by the time Bull Run comes around, they've established more of a structure, and so you came down from Jefferson Davis, and that whole flow down from that with the Secretary of War and all of his advisors, and the command structure basically at Bull Run at that time, say on the 16th of July when the Federal Army moved out, was PGT Beauregard.
Right.
Was in command. There were two armies in Virginia at that time. It was the Army of the Shenandoah, which is over by Winchester, that was under the command of Joseph Johnson, and the Army of the Potomac, which was under Beauregard, that was around Manassas. So, Federal Army moves out on the 16th to go and deal with Beauregard, okay, because Johnson was in the valley facing off against Robert Patterson. The thought was that those two armies would not join up together.
Right.
But despite that, when Irvin McDowell, who was in command of the forces around Washington that were going to move out, and that was a nameless force at the time.
Right. It wasn't the Army of the Potomac at that point.
Yeah, it had no name.
Right.
McDowell.
It wasn't called. I'm sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you like that. But it wasn't called the Army of Northern Virginia at that point. Okay.
There was a Department of Northeastern Virginia.
Okay.
That McDowell was in command of. There was no name of the army.
Okay.
In fact, you won't find any contemporary references to what was called the Army of Northeastern Virginia. Subsequently, it was called that. It's called that by a lot of historians, but there's no establishment of that army. If you go through Eicher's command book, where he lists out the orders that actually formed, say, the Army of the Potomac or the Army of Northern Virginia. There was nothing for an army in Northeastern Virginia. So it was just McDowell's army. They're
still trying to figure it all out, basically, at this point, as far as what's going to be what. They're also not thinking it's going to last very long.
Right. Either side didn't think it would last very long because, you read D.H. Hill's math books from the time, and, the math problems are written. If one Southerner can kill 12 Yankees in 3 minutes, then how many Yankees can 5 Southerners kill in an hour and a half? And things like that.
Right.
So there was a lot of, I wouldn't call it hubris. They use that word a lot, hubris. I think more often it's just you're acting on what you know from the past. Mm-hmm. You referenced Little Bighorn recently. They say it's hubris what the 7th Cavalry were doing, or were they just saying? Or were they just thinking, this is what's happened in the past?
That's
so it's probably what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Right.
That's I think that Custer's thinking, I've done this before. I've split my command 3 ways. We've attacked from different ends of the village.
Right.
And we've won. Of course, they were sleeping most of those times.
It was really cold.
It was really cold. But, with details, right?
Yeah.
But no, right. And so I just, to me, it sounds more like arrogance with Custer and with the Confederates in general. Like there's just an arrogance that, is, ultimately, I guess it was, here especially was Lee's downfall, I think. Mm-hmm. They were all, not just him. He was probably, even though he was very kind confident in the ability of his men. I think he was probably the least arrogant of all of them.
Well, there's a fine line between arrogance and confidence.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. But anyway, go ahead. So to your point.
Well, no. I mean, everything was in flux. As an example, there were a lot of Confederate cavalry in Beauregard's force. Hardly any in McDowell's. Mm-hmm. And part of that is because there were a lot of militia units in the South that were cavalry-based, not so many in the North, and cavalry is very, very expensive to form up. Mm-hmm. So how much could the War Department at that time invest and train an expanded cavalry arm? Right. So there was not a lot of cavalry with McDowell, and attendant to that, the movements were very slow because most of the functions of cavalry were being performed by infantry, and they were very green infantry as well. So they move out on the 16th, and they've got several columns. And one of the things that has turned up in my research on First Bull Run is that the traditional interpretation of what McDowell wanted to do there, I don't think is quite right.
Okay.
Essentially,
what is the traditional version, and then what?
He wanted to overwhelm. He wanted to swiftly overwhelm the army at on that line of defense, the Centerville Ridge, whatever you want to call it, but the line of Bull Run, we'll call it from here on out. And in one fell swoop, have a one single grand victory. Actually, there's one book on Bull Run that's called A Single Grand Victory, I think by Ethan Refuse. And but when you look at most of that interpretation comes from what historians have thought this is what he should have been trying to do. But when you actually look at what he wrote at the time, because there's only 10 letters that exist that he wrote after that battle.
Okay.
In his whole life, there's only 10 letters that have been found, and they didn't talk about First Bull Run. But if you look at all of the plans that he had submitted prior to that, they really weren't very specific, other than we want to turn the Confederates out of their position. We don't want to try and take them in a frontal assault. We're going to turn them out of their position. And when you actually do, and I'm not going to go into it because sometimes it takes me an hour and a half, but when we really look into what that means, what a turning movement really, really is, it's basically I want to get my enemy out of this position that he has chosen.
Right.
And then, well, we'll see what happens.
Right.
Okay? Because there's any number of ways they could react.
Yeah.
Okay? So you think of Chancellorsville, big turning movement. Everything Lee ever did, turning movement.
Right.
So really it didn't progress much further in McDowell's mind then. Once I turn them out of that position, we're gonna go from there. And I think a lot of it really points to, I think they're going to run away.
Okay.
This is what I think. That's part of it. The other part is this overwhelming idea that we were going to take a larger force. The Union was going to take a larger force and defeat a smaller force. But when you actually look at McDowell's plans, he's expecting to meet about as many people as he's taken with him.
Okay.
He doesn't think that Beauregard's going to get reinforced by Johnson, but he does think he's going to get reinforced by everywhere else.
Interesting. Okay. Now, how many people does McDowell have versus Beauregard?
Great question. That's a good question. Well, combine Beauregard and Johnson, because Johnson does come over. They have about 33,000. I have the exact numbers in a book here, but I don't need to remember.
No, it's roundabout is fine.
And for many, many years, we thought that McDowell had 35,000, which would be pretty
roughly
even,
the same. Yeah.
Now, the numbers that fought each other, somewhere around 15,000 on each side.
So, in other words,
that actually engaged.
Right. So there's 30, roughly about the same 30-something thousand on each side that are there.
Yeah.
But not 100% of them are fighting.
Right.
Yeah.
But
before Johnson comes, how many people does Beauregard have?
Right around 25,000.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So
all of Johnson didn't make it in time.
Okay.
He showed up. The bulk of his force showed up a day before, between 1 and 2 days before But what we found out recently.
Listen to the rest of this interview and dozens like it. Support the show and get early access to special episodes, early and discounted ticket sales, and more. The second lieutenant level and above gets access to all monthly Patreon episodes. So please go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg, choose a tier, and join. And I thank you in advance.